All right, so officially welcome to week 5 of the grant writing workshop series. We are so excited to continue on and get through the next phases of this training. I'll do a really quick recap of last week, but today is really going to be focused on planning for ongoing evaluation. So really thinking about how to measure and track and really capture what's happening with the program that you have created. We'll make sure we give everybody a break to breathe and digest, and we want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. We definitely have time included to apply some of the learning through breakouts. So, just be ready to be engaged. So as a reminder, we had Dr. Velonis and Dr. Grant sharing a little bit about public health logic models. So the steps of how to create one, the importance of having one. All the materials, the slides, recordings, and resources are now posted on Google's site. The excitement for this week is to create a logic model. So thank you for those who have and those who are still working on it. Please remember that you have coaches as well as technical assistance providers that are here for you. So if you have questions or concerns, feel free to ask. We may not have the answers, but we do have access to these brilliant minds who may have the answers. So the more you apply the learning, the better you'll feel about it when you have to do it on your own. And with that, I see a couple of them, just make sure. I don't think that there's any questions or concerns, but I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our presenters from last week, our presenters today, Dr. Velonis and Dr. Grant, and I'll let them introduce themselves and share a little bit more about today's session.
All right. I guess I might as well start. Hi, everyone. I am Alisa Velonis. I am you all met me last week, so I teach in the School of Public Health here, and I have been doing evaluations in some way, shape, or form for probably 20 or 30 years. And what I'm really hoping that you walk away with as grant writers is realizing that describing evaluation is super important, that it's a team effort. You'll have to really work with your program developers, and that it's not a scary word.
That's good. Hi, everyone, again. I'm Dr. Alexis Grant. I came to evaluation kind of more from the research world. As a PhD student, we're really taught about research. And so evaluation more formally is a little bit newer to me, but I'll be doing it as a professional evaluator, at least until the foreseeable future. And so a lot of what I have been building experience with has been working with organizations as clients who hire me as an evaluator. And so I can also bring some insights, and just to say that just because you might hire an evaluator doesn't mean that you shouldn't plan for evaluation. Because as an evaluator, it's really hard to come in and people just tell you to evaluate something, give you no direction, especially if you want your evaluation process to be useful for your organization. So hopefully that'll help you today as we go on with our presentation.
So the learning objectives for today are really to just walk you through kind of the key elements that make up program evaluation. So again, in 2 hours, we do not believe that we will make you into program evaluators. But what I'm hoping is that you at least become familiar with all of the components of an evaluation, that you understand why these components are important, that you become familiar with different types of evaluation. And again, these are words that are going to come up for you as you begin to describe programs and describe evaluations. And really think about how programs can use the data that are captured during evaluation in order to do ongoing program improvements, you know, to make it really like, this is just part of developing and implementing a program. It isn't an afterthought. It's not well, we have to do this just to make the funders happy, which is often how I feel like in nonprofits, we approach evaluation. And then so finally, again, we really want you to be able to describe these funders or these elements to funders so that you can make the case that your organization gets it, that you understand evaluation and that you take it seriously. This is a cartoon that Alexis found, and I think it is great. It is not just something that monitoring and evaluation isn't just something that you do to please the donor, but it's really all about strengthening the program and making sure that the work that you're doing within your program is actually benefiting the people who we want it to benefit the most. So a few misconceptions about evaluation, and I think these are probably ones that many of us are familiar with, right? It is something that is expensive, it is technical, it is difficult, it takes a lot of time. It's tangential to actually offering the program. It's not really what we're supposed to be doing, but we do it because we have to. It's punitive, right? It's all about making sure that we are telling our funders that we're doing exactly what they think we should be doing. And what we really want you to think about is, again, we really want you to begin to approach evaluation as something that is very important, that is integral to your program, that is strategic, that is cost effective, right? Because again, we have limited resources with all of our programs. So don't we actually want to know that what we're spending our resources on is having an impact, is making a difference? And I also want to think about this. Evaluation is more than just bean counting. So it's something that, like, when many of us approach evaluation, we think of it as like, we are going to count the number of people who are engaged in the program, and we're going to count the number of services that we've delivered. And if we don't meet all of these metrics that we've put forward, then clearly the funder is going to say we're failing. And I want us to really shift to beginning to think about, how do we talk about evaluation as something that is about really enhancing our program, that it is helping our program, that is participatory with our program participants, and that is integrated into everything we do. So at the heart, evaluation is really asking the question, if we implement something, does it do what we want it to do? And so just to give you like a little idea or a little example of this, we're going to think about, if we were to evaluate this grant writing program. So you are all participants in this grant writing program. We here at UIC, we want to evaluate this program. We want to know if it does what it's supposed to do. So I'm going to start by thinking a little about that. So if we have a group of people from local community-based organizations, some of whom are old hats at grant writing, some of whom are not. If they are participating in this grant writing approach, does it do what we want it to do? At the end of the day, do we see successful grant submissions? So we're going to take you through these various stages of what the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, have outlined as kind of a framework for program evaluation. Now, there are a lot of frameworks that are out there. We're using this one because I think it is fairly user-friendly. It is something that when you are writing a grant, you can easily say something like, in evaluating our program, we will be using the various steps in the CDC framework for program evaluation. And it sounds pretty good. I mean, you know, at least they know that you're using something that's well regarded and well respected. So there are, as you can see, 6 different stages that they identify in program evaluation. And we are going to take you through each one of these stages, from why is it important to engage stakeholders in evaluations? How do we describe the problem? How do we then, once we've described the problem, how do we shift and look at, like, how are we going to design an evaluation? How are we going to answer our evaluation questions? Then we'll talk a little bit about like actually doing evaluation work, gathering the evidence, gathering data, and then very quickly kind of go through a little bit on coming to conclusions and justifying those, and then using those to really do program improvement. Alexis, I think this is where you're taking over, right?
You can keep going if you want.
Okay. Sorry, I was just following your instructions. So really, at the evaluation cycle really begins with engaging stakeholders. So these are the persons in the organization that have investment in what's going to be learned from an evaluation and done with the knowledge. Almost all program work really involves building some type of partnerships, right? So we have to build partnerships with the people who are implementing this program. We also have to build partnerships with the people who are participating in the program. And then we have the larger community, those who are maybe within the community, those who are affected by the program. So we really kind of, you know, as well as things like the board members and our directors and things like that. So these are all folks that that we want to engage in evaluation, and finding out from them sort of what is it that we want to learn from this process. And when stakeholders aren't engaged, when we can't show in our grant proposals, for example, that we either have a plan to engage these individuals, or that as we are building our evaluation, we have engaged them. Findings may very well be ignored, or our funders may say, you know, okay, so they don't really quite know what they're doing. So it really helps to increase the possibility that our evaluation will be useful. So questions that you want to ask yourself, particularly as you are thinking about this from the perspective of developing a program, or again, writing about the development of the program and writing about how we will evaluate it, is to think, who are the key stakeholders, and who are the people whose opinions I really need to engage in. So when I was the director of a nonprofit organization, a small nonprofit organization, I had a lot of stakeholders that I had to serve with my evaluation. I had our board members, who were really the ones that were my bosses in directing the program. I had the individuals from the outside agency that we hired to actually implement our classes and our curriculum. And I had funders who I had to satisfy. So these are the people whose information I really needed to have engaged in there. And these are the folks to whom I asked, like, what do you see as the main activities? Why are we doing this program? What are the outcomes that we want to see happen as a result of this? What kind of evaluation should be conducted? Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about this later on, but different phases of program development often have different kinds of evaluation that we would focus on. So in the very beginning of a program, we might be focused more on looking at, did we implement the program the way we thought we were going to implement it? So do we have enough kids that are in this program? Do we, are we engaging the right kids or families? But ongoing, we might be asking a lot more outcome-based questions, like, are we seeing those changes that we really wanted to see? So we need to talk with our stakeholders about that. Things like, how rigorous should the design be? And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And et cetera, et cetera. And really, I feel like this last question here, how will you use this evaluation? And if the only thing that you can answer is, we will use this evaluation to make our funders happy, then I would really urge you to think beyond just that. Yes, getting the data that your funders need is important. It's super important. But answering your own questions about how good your program is and is it doing what you want it to do is, in my opinion, as important. So again, just for fun, we're going to think about this class as something we want to evaluate it. So just like this week, I'm going to start by thinking about long-term outcomes and short-term outcomes, right? We talked about that with our logic model. And this is actually one of these places where using your logic model is so important. So can you click? Thank you. So we have two kinds of goals, two kinds of goals that we're going to think of. So in the long run, the whole reason that we are offering, or I should say that the collaboratory is offering this amazing grant writing workshop, is because we hope that you all as participants, that by giving you some additional tools to become awesome grant writers and use these tools, it will really increase the ability of the CBOs that you work with to obtain funding from public and private sources. So that's what I would say is our long-term goal. But we're probably not going to see that goal materialize immediately, right? Because it takes a little while for you to use these tools. Maybe you don't have a grant that's immediately due. And it also takes a while to write grant proposals and to hear back and see if they get funded. It's a practice process. So, but what we can do is we can look at some more immediate goals or immediate outcomes. Things like saying that we hope that by participating in this class, you all will better understand the key elements of what a strong grant proposal includes. We hope that you will walk away with an increased confidence in your ability to really write a strong grant proposal. And we also hope that you will know where to find the resources that you need in order to, again, write that strong grant proposal. So I would say these are probably three of the more immediate goals that we would have. So if I were evaluating this workshop, I would be thinking about how we could find out quickly about whether these intermediate goals are happening, as well as maybe looking further into the future to see if we see any uptake in funding from private and public sources. So again, go to your logic model, fill in your logic model, and this will help you figure it out. So again, if we want to think of it, going back to our logic model, right? Inputs. Well, in order to have this class happen, we had this wonderful MacArthur grant that allowed us to do this. We have absolutely amazing staff with the collaboratory. We have totally awesome students. I've met a few of you at this point, and I think you are outstanding. And then the faculty, you know, we're sort of okay. We kind of know what we're doing, hopefully. But really, I think that those are the strong inputs. Activities. We have a 6th session of public health-centered grant writing classes. We have skills-based practice that's part of it. So at least in the sessions that Dr. Grant and I are doing, we make you break out, talk amongst yourselves, practice some things, and then you also have assignments that you have to do and come back with. And you have a lot of support from Maggie and Marjorie and Melissa and Goody and all of the other folks from the collaboratory. So our outputs, we have however many students are attending sessions. And if I were going to count this, I would want to think about, let's say 75% of the sessions, because we know that stuff happens and you may not be able to make all of them. We can also look at the submitted assignments. We can see like how many people actually submitted those assignments, and you know, how many, you know, we're not scoring them, we're not grading them, but we can kind of get a sense there. And we can see the number of students who actually complete any follow-up evaluation. So maybe those are like what I pulled out as outputs. You may be able to come up with different outputs as well. Short-term outcomes. We're hoping that at least 3/4 of you walk away able to identify the key elements of a proposal, and we might determine that based on the assignments that you turn in. I would hope that at least 3/4 of you say that by the time you finish with these 6 sessions, you might report increased comfort with grant writing skills. It may not be quite as terrifying. And hopefully within 6 months, maybe half of you have actually applied those skills in some way, shape, or form. And then we have the longer term impacts about feedback that you might get from grant proposals that you write. Often grant proposals happen in multiple steps. So maybe you submit the proposal and you're invited to have an interview. That's an awesome outcome. Then finally, like those long-term impacts might be that I would be looking for, that I would be hoping to see would be that that there's more of a sustainment of the work, of the good work that you're doing in these communities. So hopefully that made sense. Now I think, do I get to turn it back over to Alexis?
Yes. I'll take it from here. So moving on to kind of the next stage or component of that, going back to that CDC evaluation framework, a really important part that you're going to want to think about as you write your proposals and applications is what kind of evaluation design, or do you want, what would be ideal, and thinking about how that fits into the context of your program, your organization, the timeline. And so on the slide here are some questions to kind of start with. Of, okay, what is the minimum required by a funder? So sometimes the funders might have some indication of how often they want reports and feedback, what kind of information they expect to be in it. So that's something to consider when you're coming up and thinking through an evaluation design. Again, going back to why are you doing the evaluation? What are you hoping to get out of it? What do you want to learn? How will it be used? Who is going to use it? And then very importantly, what resources do you have to conduct the evaluation? Sometimes it's really frustrating to kind of put the evaluation on the back burner and not really plan for it. And then at the end, you're thinking, okay, we have 2 weeks to evaluate this program and we have no staff time, we have no budget. And that makes it really hard to produce something that is of high quality. So kind of starting with these questions as you're working through the grant writing process can be really helpful in actually integrating that and making it integrated like we talked about. So the CDC framework also has some criteria on what makes effective evaluations. We can go to the next slide. And so that first criteria is that, of course, an effective evaluation is one that is useful. So again, thinking about who are the stakeholders, who is going to use this evaluation, and unfortunately having to prioritize like who is the most important. So say if you have a funder that you have a really long relationship with, and maybe their evaluation requirements aren't very strict, or they don't have very specific requirements, then maybe the funder isn't at the top of the list in terms of considering them for the usability of the evaluation. Like they're not going to use it, they just want it because they have to ask for it. Versus if you're hoping to use an evaluation for your organization to expand a program or change a program, that'll really impact how you design that evaluation and being able to ask those questions and integrate those questions into the evaluation. And so when you're thinking about what makes an evaluation useful, again, going back to that logic model and looking at the specific activities and outcomes and the pathways of why you think this program is going to have these specific outcomes, that can be really helpful in thinking about what are the questions I need to ask in order for the answers to be useful that we can take back and put back into the program or bring back to our program staff. And so that is the kind of first criteria there. On the next slide, effective evaluations are feasible. So of course, we're constrained by our budget, by our timelines, by our staff effort, other things going on in the organization. And so when you're starting out designing, you want to realistically think about how much money, time, skill, and effort can be devoted to the evaluation. And of course, it's going to impact what kind of data you might be able to collect, how detailed it might be, what the report will look like, if it's a 2-pager brief or a more formal 20-page report. And then actually collecting data that is appropriate for that kind of report. And also thinking about the focus of the evaluation and the amount of time that you do decide to dedicate. Is it appropriate given the resources? And is it appropriate given the size and the scope of the program? So sometimes if a program is really small, having a really grand evaluation plan for a small brand new program is not necessarily going to be useful, and it's not necessarily going to be feasible in asking questions that maybe can't be answered. So the next is that effective evaluations are proprietary, is what the CDC language says, but I like to think of it as ethical. So thinking about what are our ethical priorities. So for instance, if getting community input is really important to you and hearing community voices is really important to you, then maybe doing a 5-question survey with multiple choice answers is not necessarily the design you want to go with. And so thinking about what are your priorities in terms of your own personal priorities, in terms of the ethics of what it looks like to collect data about this program is something that you and your team will have to decide on. And also thinking about who needs to be involved in the evaluation to be ethical. So if, for instance, you have a program dealing with domestic violence survivors, then I think ethically it would be really important to include the survivors in the creation of that survey instrument. So you're not asking questions that are potentially traumatizing. And then are there components of the program or measures that should be included for reasons of ethics? So thinking back to the logic model and your pathways linking the program components to the changes you expect to see. Depending on the program, it might be really important to measure that actual pathway of, is what we're hoping the outcome is actually happening because of the program? And then, of course, what guidelines do you want to have or want to follow, of which there are a lot of different guidelines, particularly if you're working with specific populations. There's really great resources on working with youth or working with survivors or working with incarcerated populations. So definitely looking into those kind of things if there are specific guidelines based on the context. Alisa, did you have anything to expound on for the comment in the chat?
No, I just, as you were talking, I saw somebody, Walden, asked about whether if a funder doesn't actually identify the criteria that they want to see in an evaluation, is it okay for the program to identify the specific criteria that they care about? And I said, absolutely. In fact, I think it's important that in addition to whatever a funder says, you think about what you need to learn about your program in order to, again, get the data, get the information, get the evidence that concerns you about your program.
Yeah, it's really important. So the last category of effective evaluations here is that they're accurate. So just because you ask questions of participants doesn't mean that what they'll give back to you is necessarily going to be accurate. So for instance, if we do, if at the end of this workshop, we don't send you a follow-up survey until 6 months from now, and we ask, hey, how's your confidence in applying for grants increase as a result of the workshop? We may or may not get good responses. Well, we may or may not get accurate responses because it's been a while since the workshop. And maybe you've taken other workshops since you've completed this one. So yeah, you have higher confidence now, but is that because of our workshop? I hope so. But thinking about your procedures and your timeline and how that impacts what kind of data you're going to get.
I also want to just add that how you collect or how you decide to collect those data are equally important, because if we were to say, write your name on this evaluation and tell us what you think, and we get all sorts of responses back that say, this was the best workshop ever, then I would have to question, like, whether is that true, or is it that you are telling us what you think we want to hear because we know who you are and we don't want, you don't want to hurt our feelings in some way, or you don't want us to think that you in particular didn't. So again, these are all sorts of important things to think about when you think about how to accurately get information.
Yeah, so that's why a lot of the time when you see surveys, we don't typically ask for your name because it's not important to the evaluation. And if you think it can be traced back to you, then you might answer a different way that's not as accurate. And so thinking about that as you're going into this evaluation design process is going to be really important in terms of what kind of data you'll get. Because once you have the data, you can't really fix the quality of the data. You just have to work with it. So it's better to plan ahead so you're not working with maybe you only have 10 responses out of the 100 people, and you can't really fix that after the fact. So you can go to the next slide. So as Alisa mentioned, there are different types of evaluations, and the type that you might choose, and you can do multiple components of these and some kind of integration of it, depending on the program, depending on the phase of the program, the timeline that you have, and kind of those different contextual factors that we briefly talked about. So performance monitoring is one of those categories, and it really focuses on accountability for the program activities. So kind of like the beginning, really focus on the beginning section of that logic model. So like, do we have the resources? Are we using those resources to do the activities we said that we were going to do? So it's very focused on just monitoring and reporting on the process, and also can be helpful for giving an early warning of problems. Like we have funding for this many staff members, but we weren't able to hire that many staff members, and now it's affecting maybe the program quality. So performance monitoring can be something that's ongoing throughout the program, and particularly funders might find it more important if you're starting a new program. So the next kind of category of evaluation is a process evaluation. Sometimes it's called a formative evaluation also, but it really focuses on looking at the strategy, initiative, or the program that's being implemented and planned according to the schedule. So looking at we did this training, did the people who completed the training actually attend the sessions? What did those look like? Were there any strengths and weaknesses of what we've done so far? And it gives a glance into if the effort is actually producing the intended output. Are people attending the sessions? What have we done to ensure that people are attending the sessions? When do we send those reminder emails? So process evaluations can be done at the beginning of a program or shortly after starting a program, which is kind of more helpful, I think, because then you can use that information about that process to feed back into the program. then the third big category is an outcome or a summative evaluation. So really this one's focused on whether or not the program achieved the desired outcomes. What made the program effective or ineffective, and is it sustainable and replicable? So more of an outcome evaluation or a summative evaluation is when you actually start to see those outcomes. So typically that happens towards the end of a program or after the program's over, really looking at, and you can define the scope of it in terms of the short-term, intermediate, long-term outcomes. And so sometimes people will do evaluations over the course of years if they're really interested in doing, in looking at those long-term outcomes. Alisa, you want to take this one?
Sure. So we're going to go back to this idea of using the logic model as a guide. And so you're going to walk away from here going, oh my gosh, Dr. Velonis only talks about logic models. Well, I like logic models. So again, if we think about, we go back to the logic models that we were thinking about. Well, actually, this one is about teen pregnancy, I see. I didn't change that one, but so let's give you, and let's go on to the next one. I see. So if we are trying to evaluate the different pieces of a teen pregnancy prevention model, for example, and we might think about how do we answer the questions that we're asking above, it looks like. And this is kind of confusing. So I am going to go to the next slide.
Yeah, the next one goes back to our grant writing.
That's what I thought. Okay. So I thought that I had these coming in differently. Okay. Let's see, Goody, can you move that? Yeah, thank you. Good. So if we're looking at things like the inputs or the activities, right? So with our activities and inputs, we say we have this grant, or we hope to have this grant, we have the staff, we have the students, we have the faculty. So can you bring up that? So now we've got to ask ourselves, what questions are we going to ask in order to measure those inputs? And so we might then want to ask ourselves, as we're especially doing a process evaluation, do we have the resources that we thought we were going to have? Did we, we got the MacArthur grant, but let's ask, were the instructors really the right people to teach this class? So we might want to have that as one of our questions that we ask ourselves about our inputs. When we look at that middle, the middle section where we're looking at our outputs, we have questions that are like the number of students who attended the class, the number of people who submitted assignments. So some of my more process-oriented questions would be, how many students attended most of the sessions? How many students submitted most of the assignments? How many skills building sessions were actually included in the instruction? So we say that we have these activities that are about skills building. Did we actually end up including those skills building sessions in there? I might also ask, knowing that you had these one-on-one sessions with mentors, I would want to ask how many of those sessions actually happened. So if we say we do these sessions, but only 2 of the 20 students actually scheduled one-on-one sessions with mentors, or only 2 mentors were available to have these sessions, then again, as a process question, I would say, well, that's a place where we didn't do so well. And that could affect our longer term outcomes, right? Because part of why we're asking ourselves these questions, especially these very process-oriented questions, is to figure out if the way that we said we implemented this program was actually implemented. Because if we don't have the outcomes that we want to have, then we want to look to see, did we actually do things the way that we thought we were going to be doing them? So then again, if we then move on to looking at the outcomes, the longer term outcomes and the impacts, then the questions that I might ask would be things like, did students actually demonstrate an increased understanding? Did they say that they were more comfortable? Did they indicate that they planned to use the skills they gained within 6 months of completion? So that's a question that we might be able to ask immediately following the course. And then in 6 months, we might ask, did you submit any grants within 6 months of doing this class? Now, with each of these questions, we also have to begin to think about, how do we get evidence to support whether this happened or not? How do we collect these data to know whether or not these happened? And I think that that's probably where we're going to go next, right?
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about questions. So we're going to go into breakouts in a little bit, where you all are going to come up with your own evaluation questions with an example. So to kind of prime you, we talked about those 3 types of evaluations, as well as gave an example of moving from the logic model to the actual evaluation question. So here are some more kind of examples on performance monitoring evaluation questions. So was this activity implemented as we planned? Did it occur at an acceptable level? What was the cost for implementing activities? And then with process evaluation, looking at what has or has not worked, what factors have prevented progress on the outcomes that we wanted to focus on. Were there specific factors that were responsible for whether or not that progress happened? Were there changes in specific outcomes due to the activities that we did in our program, as opposed to maybe something else that happened in the community or some other program that participants engaged in? And are there any factors that prevented the activities from being implemented as planned? And were there other specific things responsible? Some examples of outcome or summative questions: what changes do we see? So again, thinking about those outcomes. How did this effort cause or contribute to the changes that we see? What is the cost benefit or cost effectiveness of the outcomes? And in some cases, you might want to show that to the funders so they keep funding you. And did these outcomes occur at an acceptable level? And sometimes using comparison point can be really helpful for that. So we're going to go into breakouts.
I'm sorry, can we go back to slide 24 for a second?
Sure.
Thanks. All right.
I breezed through those.
No, I got it. I took a picture.
Great. And so we're going to go into breakouts, and I'll attach a file in the chat. So in your breakouts, we're going to go back to that community garden example from last week. So the document will have the community garden description, program description that we had last week. And in your groups, we're going to take about 15 minutes to come up with different questions about this program. And there's no wrong answers. You can ask so many different questions about programs, and it really goes back to what is useful, what is feasible, what is acceptable for you and the funders and the community and whoever else is involved in the evaluation. So before we go into that, any questions? Okay.
All right, welcome back. I will give it back to Alisa and Alexis.
All right, how did it go? Okay, I see a thumbs up.
I see a thumbs up.
Were
So
there any
what-
questions?
Yeah, so what were some of your performance measure question ideas?
So one we had was like, does the school have the sufficient resources? Does it have enough staff to dedicate time to teaching these workshops?
Great. What else?
Another one we had was like, what are the financial costs of starting these activities? Kind of like, I guess, planning out a budget for the workshop.
Mhm.
Okay.
Team one had, were garden instructions given clearly and were activities performed according to the instructions.
Okay, so were the instructions for who given clearly?
Oh, were instructions by staff given clearly to the participants, planting the fruits and vegetables, I guess.
Okay. Great. Keeping in mind also that these are instructions for like preschool kids, right? So that's really important, right? If we talk to preschool kids in an adult language, we're probably not going to get the outcomes that we want. So great.
Alyssa, you were on, so I have the notes for group 2. This one was for performance, right? A question for performance monitoring?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so were the gardening interventions implemented as planned?
Okay, that's a really big question, right? Because there are a lot of interventions and there's a lot of places where things that you're implementing. So in the long run, like I would encourage you to maybe even break that out just a little bit more. But how about process evaluation questions?
One of the questions we came up with in our group was, are the participants demonstrating interest or engagement in the activities being conducted?
And how do you think you would determine that? Are they like?
Yeah, I mean, we thought of a few different ways, but since they're preschoolers, it would really be up to like the teachers, sort of just like seeing the questions that students are asking, their excitement. But then one other idea we thought of was getting the kids to journal, like maybe what vegetables they're eating, or something like that. Draw pictures of vegetables.
That's a great idea. In fact, that's a whole nother activity. And I'll bet that we can think of how that activity in and of itself of journaling, like what are you eating and drawing pictures, right? That probably will help to reinforce a lot of the other things. So great job.
Yeah.
You know, also too, we're talking about parent engagement, parent involvement, and learning from the parent. You know, when kids experience something really exciting in preschool or kindergarten, they come home and really talk about it all day. So if they're not talking about it, then, you know, they probably weren't as excited about it. So just learning from parents, if they're seeing any changes in their children at home, whether it's more vegetable consumption or specifically asking for vegetables at the grocery store, that kind of thing can help to measure their excitement.
That might even be an outcome evaluation, like an immediate outcome evaluation question, right? Like, you know, as a result of having gone to these classes and had their hands in the dirt and playing, are they talking about fruits and vegetables at home? That's a really good immediate, immediate outcome kind of question. Edgar, you wrote, what factors prevented progress on program outcomes?
Yes.
How can you talk about that as a process evaluation question?
Group 2?
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask folks to step up because I was just taking notes.
Actually, Edgar, I think you were in group 3. So Justin and Luz.
Oh, my apologies. Group 3.
So if the goals weren't met or the objectives weren't met, if the youth did not perform up to the expectation, just try to determine why or what could be done to improve the success, right? Or try to figure out why it didn't work,
Right.
so to speak.
In some ways, that's like you've just gotten to the heart of why we do process evaluation, right? We do a process evaluation to see, like, are the things that we said we were going to do, are the activities, did they actually work out the way we thought they were going to work out? And in part, we do that in order to identify, like, why didn't we get the outcomes that we wanted to have? So that's, you've kind of like really gotten to the heart of one big piece of why we even worry about this evaluation to begin with. So hopefully if you were to, like, say your immediate outcomes weren't being met, like kids weren't going home and talking about the excitement that they had or talking about dinner, or the parents weren't watching the videos, then some of our process evaluation questions could ask that question of why didn't that happen? So.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of along those lines, before we started really getting into brainstorming our questions, I feel like my group, and maybe not everyone, but certainly I am wondering if you could explain one more time, like the key difference between the process evaluation and the performance monitoring.
I like to think.
Yeah.
Oh,
Take this
I'm
out.
gonna jump in.
Good. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah. So performance monitoring, I like to think of it more as like an ongoing thing that happens throughout the process of a program being implemented. So not necessarily not necessarily looking at the outcomes, not necessarily looking at like the changes that you're expecting to see in the program, but really focused on what is going into the program. Like thinking about staff time of, okay, on our logic model, we had 3 staff members who were supposed to implement this program. And did we get enough of those staff members? And are they dedicating the time to the program that they were supposed to be dedicating? And thinking about, okay, what can be done to remedy that if it's not happening? And so I think of the main difference of being like the use and the purpose of it is going to impact what kind of question you ask and how specific you're going to be in the kind of data you might be collecting. Alisa, you have anything to add?
No, not really. In fact, I often don't differentiate. I consider performance management and process. I mean, I consider process evaluation to be the kinds of things that you do throughout the course of the program. The things that you need to monitor to know that your program is being implemented like the way that it should be implemented. So I think Alexis is right, like thinking about those things that are constantly happening. And these are things that you should be looking at regularly, just in terms of like making sure that your program is going according to plan. And whereas I think if you really want to differentiate that with process you can think about in terms of like, at the end of the program, let's say it's not an ongoing program, but it's something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So maybe you look back at the end of the program and you say, did we have the right number of sessions? If there's like, this should be a 10-week session. Well, did we have the right number of sessions that we're supposed to have? And did people actually attend them, right? Because, okay, so we had 10 gardening sessions, but, half of the kids all, took their summer vacation or went somewhere. during this time. So really none of the kids got more than half of the intervention, so to speak. So those are process questions that like I might look back on. And I think the way that Alexis is identifying the program evaluation or monitoring questions are things that you would be asking every week and looking at and using to immediately make those changes.
Good question.
But I do think that there's some overlap, and I would say, like, you know, again, I'm more interested in the questions that you're asking than where they fit.
Yeah, funders don't necessarily care. They don't care what category they are. So it's more so just as a frame of these are the different types of questions you could ask for your own reference.
And again, as you're writing the grant proposal, it's important probably to distinguish these different kinds of approaches to evaluation, again, as a way of saying, like, we get this, we understand what we're talking about. So we will on a regular basis monitor X, Y, and Z, and we'll be capturing these metrics, you know, on a regular basis. So those are kind of like the performance and outcomes. Now, our real outcome, our immediate outcome is, do we see kids? Well, I should ask you, what were some of your outcome questions?
One of our outcome questions is like to the families of the children. So we asked them, like, did they start their own garden at home? How often are they cooking with fruits and vegetables? We want to ask the children, like how often are you choosing fruits and vegetables, like at lunch, and then like having like a weekly, like asking that weekly.
That's a great outcome question. Did you see an increase in the amount of fruits and vegetables that kids in the program and families in the program consumed? Perfect, that's great. Oh, did children increase their willingness to consume fruits and vegetables? Great. Did the children gain hands-on experience in planting, growing, and harvesting fruits and vegetables? I think, yes, that is both an immediate outcome. That might also be a process evaluation question. And again, this is where I'm saying that some of these are kind of, often there's a gray zone, right? Because on one hand, we could say, did children get hands-on experiences? Did they actually participate in the program? But it could also be an outcome. So that's great. Did the participants' health outcomes improve? I'm going to say that that's definitely an outcome, and that's probably more of a long-term outcome than a short-term outcome. We didn't ask you to distinguish them, but I think that that's a great way of thinking about these kind of like along that time continuum.
Yeah, these are great examples.
Excellent, excellent. You guys totally have this.
So let's take our 5-minute break. And so we'll come back at, take 5 minutes, go to the bathroom, stretch your legs, get your coffee, whatever you need to do. And we'll come back, a couple more slides. Oh yeah, recording's important. So we have a couple more slides here to go through that kind of last half of that CDC evaluation framework. So we're going to go through the actual data gathering process, which you can do like a whole course about. So this is very surface level of things just to think about as you plan. A little bit about justifying conclusions, and then thinking about how you will ensure the use of your evaluation findings. So gathering credible evidence. So this is like the data collection part. Rather than just thinking about, okay, we want to do a survey and we want these questions on the survey, think about kind of the big picture, going back to your outcomes, going back to your goals. What are the specific goals that we have? What are the changes that we want to see? And then working backwards on thinking about how do we measure that thing? So if we're interested in change in interest of eating fruits and vegetables, specifically looking at a change, then that question really lends itself to doing a pre and a post measurement of some sort. So then after you have both of those data points, you can compare them for each person. So thinking about translating your concepts and your goals into specific measures can really be helpful in thinking about what kind of data you'll collect, when you'll collect it, and how you're going to eventually analyze it and use that for your report. And there are a lot of different ways to gather evidence. So you can, of course, get it from people, program participants, program staff, other people who are involved in the implementation. You can gather evidence from documents, particularly if you're doing more of a process evaluation, or those process questions of how we did things, how many people attended. Like going back into documents is helpful for that. Doing observations, and this observations might be something that is preferred for children, for instance, where it's difficult you can't give them a pen and paper and tell them to do a survey. And then think about how you'll integrate that data. So again, this is going to be constrained potentially by the time that you have, the resources that you have. So thinking about prioritizing what kind of data you'll gather based on what is available to you. And you want to have quality data. You want to think about, getting that valid, accurate information, and also the quantity of data. I think we have this over tendency to survey everybody. And that's not necessarily what you need in order for the data to tell you the thing that it needs to tell you. So if you have a program with 1,000 people that participate, then maybe your goal is to survey 100 of them. And that's enough. And that's something that you need to decide with your organization, with the funder and the other stakeholders who are going to be the ones looking at that data. And then, of course, the logistics of gathering data and how much time you have, how much money you have, and what are the barriers. So something if any of you have been in research spheres, you've probably heard of these different types of designs. It's not necessarily important for you to know how these designs work. But again, just thinking about the language of things that you might hear and things that potentially a funder might ask for. So an experimental design is a randomized controlled trial, which is considered really the gold standard, is what they call it. And the main characteristic of a randomized controlled trial is that you take this group of people, you randomly assign them to either receive the intervention or go attend the program or whatever. And then the other people are randomly assigned to a control condition, which could be them not attending any program. It could be them attending the standard program. And then by whatever data you collect for both of these groups, you'll be able to more accurately say whether or not participation in this program is predictive of some change or some outcome. Realistically, that's really difficult to do, and it's really time consuming. Alisa put in the chat, it's rarely feasible.
Go back to that feasibility, right? That is not feasible. And in some cases, for many of us, it wouldn't be considered ethical either, right? If we think we have an evidence-based program, one that is working because we've designed it as such, why would we ethically then deny some group of people the ability to be in our program? And it's yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so rarely that really happens outside in the real world. So what we'll most often see are quasi experimental, which is a design where there is some kind of comparison group, but there's no random assignment. So maybe you have a program and whoever wants to attend the program or sign up for the program, you're going to collect that data from them. And then maybe you'll survey some random people in the community who decided not to sign up for the program. And you can look at differences between those groups. There's a lot of different categories of quasi-experimental designs. And then there are non-experimental designs as well, where maybe you only look at people who participated in the program and you don't necessarily compare them to other groups. And so thinking back to what kind of evaluations are useful and feasible and accurate in terms of answering your evaluation questions is going to help guide what kind of design that you think is going to be the most effective for your evaluation. So the next category with that CDC framework is to justify the conclusion. So once you have your data, you have to make sense of it, right? So you have to think about, okay, what is our definition of a successful program? Your data is not going to tell you by itself whether or not the program is successful. You need to come up with that definition. So thinking about maybe a % increase in children choosing fruits and vegetables. What is the benchmark of success and how do we talk about that? Thinking about what do the findings mean and are they significant? If there are only 2 program participants out of the 150 that said this program is helpful, that's something like, do those findings mean anything to you? Does it mean anything to your program? And that's, again, something that you and your team will decide how sensitive you want to be to differing opinions in your data. And then thinking about like the judgment of the program. So what is the worth or is the significance of the program based on the evidence? So thinking about going way back to when we talked about the theory of change in your logic models and the outcomes that you're going to see, how does all of that connect together? What does that mean in terms of the worth of the program? And then, of course, thinking about the recommendations of what's next. What do we do with this information? What do we do with these data about the program's effectiveness or the process of implementing this program? Because a lot of the times, if we think of evaluation as something that funders ask for, and that's the reason you do it, then you're just creating documents to sit on a thumb drive somewhere or in the cloud or whatever. And that's not really a good use of your time and the participants' time that you're going to be collecting information from. So thinking about those recommendations of what do we do with this information. And the last, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead and finish. I want to make sure that we have a little bit of a chance to address Andrea's question that she just put in the chat, because it's more I was just trying to answer it and it's way more complex than I feel like I can put in a chat. Okay, we'll come to it. I think we just have like 2 more slides, so we'll have time for it. So the last category is ensuring the use and sharing those lessons learned, sharing those recommendations, because we want our evaluations to be useful. And so a lot of the times we think of, at least in like my world, we think of reports as like the traditional thing where you say like, here's the description of the program, here's how we evaluated, here is the information that we found out. And that's not necessarily what's going to be the most useful to you or most useful to the funders or most useful to the program staff. So again, thinking about who is going to use the evaluation findings and what is the best format for them. So sometimes you might want to share back evaluation findings with the participants and you want to create like a 1-pager or a flyer or something. And so the information format you need for that is going to look very different than maybe sharing back evaluation findings to your board, which maybe is a presentation. So thinking about preparing for that as you plan an evaluation or even as you budget staff time for evaluation, which is part of the project, thinking about what is the ultimate output that we're going to create, a tangible output that we're going to create from this evaluation. And thinking about if and when there is space for feedback and follow-up. So if your goal for the evaluation is to inform the next iteration of the program, maybe we do, so say we're doing another grant writing course in the fall, and we want to have our evaluation findings shared with all the instructors, with all the planners. And then what is the follow-up for that? How are we going to actually implement those recommendations and make sure it happens? Identifying that process. And then lastly, the dissemination of how it will be communicated, how it will be tailored to the audience, especially if you are sharing findings with
people outside of your organization or not familiar with the program, maybe your program description looks very different than the way that you would share it with your funders. And so kind of a quick overview of expenses to think about with evaluation. So you have staff time, your personnel costs, and this can look different, again, depending on the scope you want to take. If you have an internal evaluator at your organization, whether that person's brought on when you get the funding or that's something you already have, their time is going to be a different cost than your other staff time. Another option is to do an independent or a subcontracted evaluator, where they bill you for the number of hours that they are working on the project. And thinking about additional staff time to assist with specific tasks. So if you're going to be doing interviews and you want your staff to help recruit, then that would be something to incorporate into your budget and your timeline. Another cost that you want to think about is compensation for participants, and appreciation for their time, potentially travel or childcare expenses. If you're asking them to come to the program on a day they don't usually come, or stay longer, it's really important. And really key to getting accurate data is making it easy for the participants and not a burden on them to give you the information that you're asking for. And then, of course, there's going to be the material costs of actually doing the evaluation. So if you need to do, if you need translation or interpretation, if you're doing interviews or having surveys in different languages, if you need to subscribe to specific software, print, postage, refreshments, if you're doing a focus group, etc. So those are important things to have in your budget somewhere, so that you're not like picking from the bottom of the pile and working with what might be left after the program's done. And that is all the slides. So now we have time for questions. So I'll read out the one in the chat. So Andrea said, I struggle with knowing if, when comparing groups, there's enough control with other factors, potentially influencing what is measured in a program. Research projects seem easier sometimes to manage these, but with clients engaged in programming, it seems harder for me to know if our program is actually influencing the measured outcome.
I think that's a really, that's a really valid question. And it's something that again, if we think about in real world situations, is really kind of true. There is only so much we can do to make that determination. If you're talking about kind of in that quasi experimental design phase, like where you are maybe looking at your community as opposed to another community, or you're doing in that kind of way, I think you just do your best, right? Some of it is measuring those factors that you think might influence, and see, can you show that these factors may be evident in the other community as well, or in the other group as well, if you're doing that kind of thing, or if you're matching somehow, like you have 10 people who get this, and you have another 10 people who should get it, but you just don't have space for them. Do you have a way of like kind of identifying which do you have a way of showing like these two people are really close to each other, these two people are really close to each other? But that's again, that's still a lot more control over the situation than most of us have in our actual programs. So some of it is also acknowledging that, like thinking it through and saying, okay, well, we know that it's possible that people in this community talk to people in this other community, and so maybe the people in that other community also learned some of the same things that the people in our group did. And just acknowledging that upfront, I think, is maybe like one one thing to do. You certainly can ask one of us to talk about, like, to, you know, help you if it's just a matter of like statistically controlling for those environments, but that's not really realistic as a way of necessarily doing it again in a long-term setting. I don't know, Alexis Goody, do you have other?
Yeah, it is difficult in the real world setting. I think one of the questions that I think informs this a lot is how much rigor do you really need? So, you know, a randomized controlled trial, again, the gold standard, but it's expensive. It's more expensive because you need more people, and there needs to be a group of people who don't get the intervention. And then you have to have the same exact data collection procedures for both of those groups so you can compare them. So there's a lot more logistically that just setting it up is extra steps that necessarily will or will not pay off if you actually need that randomized controlled trial. So yeah, like Alisa said, potentially comparing between different communities, or even people who did different programs in your organization. Maybe you can look at outcomes between those. Something that could also be helpful is thinking about trying to understand that pathway of those changes can be helpful in figuring out whether or not the specific parts of the program are leading to those outcomes. So trying to be as specific as possible when you're doing those measurements, so you can think about like, okay, we did this workshop and we had these homework assignments, and now we have a question about, did the assignments help you understand the content better? And people said no, or people said yes. And so you can actually use that to think about what about this grant writing workshop is actually helping according to the participants. Yeah, going back to your theory of change could be really helpful in figuring out what is happening here.
So, and I'm going to add, and I might muddy the water, so hopefully the two doctors can clean it up, but there's a couple of pieces that I wanted to call out, which was when Dr. Grant was talking about how to share the dissemination piece. I think that also helps. So when you come up with your analysis, or when you come up with, you know, what does this data really show? What is the evaluation showing? It's always great to go back to the participants and say, is this accurate? Is this appropriate? And that can help you make that tie back. And they, you know, so back to what she just said was like, yes, it was this training, or somebody can say, well, this training was one of the reasons why I got this, but it was really because X, Y, and Z. And so you can get some of that clarification. And it's always just good to, because as you've engaged your stakeholders from the beginning, you want to ensure those stakeholders, you know, you are saying things that are appropriate in the after. And Andrew, I really appreciate the question, because it's a lot of this that we are talking about comes from bench research and these very like clean research scientific processes, which don't work in the real world, right? Or are not as controllable in the real world. And I think that's fine. I think that's why, you know, we're saying that there's more reason for us to do these real world examples and projects, and you know, have different people sharing their different outcomes. And one of the things that I really wish that we as a academic society were more okay with, and funders were more okay with, was what doesn't work, and sharing that out more. And I know that there has been a bit of a shift of that to say that, okay, this wasn't a direct impact, or this didn't, but this did provide X, Y, and Z. And I think that there's value in that. And I think that there's more of that that's happening these days. So again, apologies for muddying the water, but thanks for, it's a good question.
No, I don't think you muddied the water at all. And I think that what you're getting at is that one of the things that we don't always do in evaluation is ask why something works. And if we're not asking why something is working, then we can't, or how it works, then we can't answer the question. You know, we can't figure out, like, how do we keep doing it, or what do we keep doing? So Andrea, some of what you're getting at is also like, you know, how do we address those questions of, and build those questions of how does something work or why does something work into our initial evaluation questions. So we might want to set it up from the beginning, as Goody was talking about, right? To figure out bringing people together at the end and saying, so we learned this and this, but can we ask you, does this make sense? Does this resonate, and why? What part of this actually, like what part of our workshop was the most useful to it? And why? What did you already know when you came in? And what did you learn while you were here? Like, those are ways that we could build that in from the beginning to ask people those questions.
Any other questions from the group? We have time.
So from a grant writing perspective, what can we do to help increase your confidence in your ability to describe an evaluation to a potential funder?
I actually have a question that kind of leans to that a little bit. Part of my role at a medical system is to kind of evaluate. So if our mission is to improve health outcomes, right, for people experiencing homelessness, it sounds great, but when you really kind of dive into the nitty gritty, how do you really measure success in that way if maybe you're interacting with a transient population? So if I could check your blood pressure every week for 10 weeks, obviously I can measure your health outcomes, right? And I can note if your health outcomes were increased positively or if they decreased negatively. But if you're dealing with someone that you may see one time, because maybe they're no longer at the shelter, or because maybe they no longer come to the program, how do you really, with integrity, measure positive health outcomes? And so that's something that I'm kind of thinking through now in ways to evaluate our program, if that's our mission. So I'm wondering if you have any guidance on that.
Wow, you really have your work cut out for you with that. Off the top of my head, I guess I would think about showing the immediate, identifying what are the immediate outcomes from that you can show with those individuals that you are serving. And then if some of what you're doing is taking this the next step, but you can't ever follow up with these individuals, would be justifying these immediate outcomes as being related to longer term outcomes, and showing that in the scientific literature, these immediate outcomes often can contribute to these longer term outcomes. But being very clear that the program that you are a part of is unable to directly follow people that long.
I love that. Oh,
that's my best.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and kind of to add on to that, maybe something, going back to that theory of change again, if you're thinking, hey, if we get people enrolled in insurance and we have these list of services that they are able to complete at this potentially one-time visit, then they'll have better improvement in health outcomes. So again, thinking about those specific components of what happens during the visit can be an important piece of data rather than number of people who walked through the door and got something. So again, thinking about specifics. And then you can also use that to look at, okay, what in our theory of change is not happening? and how can we integrate that, or how can we kind of adjust based on that information?
Thank you both so much.
Any other questions? We have a few minutes if anyone has a lingering thing or troubleshooting. So everyone understands evaluation now? That's great.
You just put yourself out of a job, is what I'm hearing.
No. I got more clients now.
Better than I did before. Thank you.
I'm gonna put my email in the chat also, because I want you to feel like if you know, a few months from now or whenever you're like, gosh, I just don't know how to fill in the blank, you know, feel free to reach out. That's partly why we're all here. So don't hesitate to, you know, remind me that, hey, we sat through your evaluation talk and I'm realizing I didn't understand 2/3 of what you said now that I have to actually do it, which is totally legit.
And on that note, and of course, if you still have questions, I know we still have a couple of minutes, you know, feel free to interrupt me, but I did want to share this week's assignment. Again, the reason for the work that we give you is so that you can apply the knowledge and really see if, you know, if you do understand it, or as you're working through it, where the questions are coming up. So taking the logic model, and if you haven't done your logic model, you know, please try to get to that first, to create the logic model, and then pick one type of evaluation and write out the goals of the evaluation questions. Alexis, I don't know if you want to explain this a little bit more.
Yeah, it's kind of taking that logic model and walking through what we walked through today. So what are the goals of the evaluation is number one there. And your goals can be based on a specific part of the program. It doesn't need to be the whole logic model. Like if you're just interested in the outcomes, you can focus on the outcomes, or even like one category of activities. Writing down some evaluation questions and walking from the questions to that design. So how are we going to measure these things? How are we going to answer the questions? And then thinking about what resources you need to conduct the evaluation, staff time, money, how much money you think it could be if you're going to do multiple focus groups, how much staff time does that take, and how much do you want to spend on snacks, for instance. So just kind of exercise to think through, like, what are the kind of things that I would put into a proposal about this hypothetical evaluation or real evaluation that you have to do for your program.
On that note, wanted to say thank you to Dr. Grant and Dr. Velonis. That is Maggie's email, but as Dr. Velonis said, you can reach out to any of us, but you can always reach out to Maggie and she can get a hold of any of us. But thank you for the presentation today, as well as last week. Thank you all for your engagement today. Enjoy, and we will be in touch. Take care.
Bye, everyone.